In the history of the Great Patriotic War, there are names that will forever remain symbols of courage and military skill. One of them is Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan, the only Armenian marshal who rose from a simple staff officer to front commander. Today, we will tell you about the man who liberated the Baltic states, commanded Operation Bagration, and stormed the last bastions of the Third Reich. The story of the Armenian lion who became one of the architects of the great victory. Subscribe to our channel to learn more stories about the forgotten heroes of the Great Patriotic War. And in the comments, discuss. Do you consider Operation Bagration to be the turning point of the war? Or was the Battle of Stalingrad the main one? We look forward to your opinions. In 1897, in the small Armenian village of Chardakli, located in the Yelizavetpol province, a boy was born who was destined to become the only Armenian marshal in the history of the Soviet Union. Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan was born into a family of railway workers, where he absorbed the traditions of the Armenian people and Russian culture from childhood. The father of the future marshal, Christopher Bagramyan, worked on the Transcaucasian Railway and was an educated man by the standards of the time. His mother, Mariam, came from an ancient Armenian family and preserved family traditions about the glorious past of her people. The Bagramyans spoke Armenian and Russian at home, which shaped young Ivan's unique worldview. He felt himself to be both a son of the Armenian people and a citizen of the Russian Empire. Ivan's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of respect for education and work. His father often told his son about the great Armenian commanders of the past, about how Armenians served in the Russian army, and glorified their name on the battlefields. These stories touched the boy's soul and shaped his character. But who could have guessed then that this modest Armenian boy would become one of the architects of the greatest victory in human history? The Bagramyan family lived modestly but with dignity. Christopher Ivanovich was a demanding father who instilled discipline and responsibility in his son from an early age. Mariam, on the other hand, surrounded Ivan with care and affection, telling him Armenian fairy tales and legends about the heroes of antiquity. It was in this atmosphere of love and strictness that the character of the future commander was formed. When Ivan turned 7, the family moved to Tiflis, where his father received a promotion. Tiflis in those years was a multinational city, where the cultures and traditions of different peoples of the Caucasus intertwined. Here, the young Bagramyan first encountered the diversity of the world and learned to understand and respect other cultures, which later proved very useful to him in commanding multinational military units. In Tiflis, Ivan enrolled in a gymnasium, where he proved himself to be a capable and diligent student. He was particularly attracted to history and mathematics. His teachers noted his analytical mind and ability to quickly grasp complex material. How could they have known that they were sitting in front of a future strategist who would plan operations involving hundreds of thousands of soldiers? His gymnasium years were a time of spiritual growth for Ivan. He read a lot, was interested in the history of military art, and studied the biographies of great commanders. He was particularly fascinated by Alexander Suvorov and Mikhail Kutuzov. The young man dreamed of a military career, but his father saw his future in civil service. In 1914, Ivan graduated from high school with a gold medal and entered the Tiflis Teachers Institute. His father hoped that his son would become a teacher and live a quiet, measured life. But history had other plans. World War I began, which drastically changed the fate of the young Armenian. The roar of artillery fire during World War I destroyed the plans for a peaceful life for millions of young people throughout the Russian Empire. Ivan Bagramyan, who was 17 at the time, could not remain on the sidelines of the events that were shaking the world. In 1914, he submitted a report on early conscription into the army, despite his parents' protests. The Military Registration and Enlistment Office sent the young Armenian to the Tiflis Infantry Cadet School, where he was to receive an officer's rank. The school was famous for its traditions and strict discipline. Here, Bagramyan seriously studied military affairs for the first time. Tactics, strategy, and military history. His teachers noted the young man's extraordinary ability to analyze military operations and understand complex tactical tasks. At the school, Ivan met future officers from different parts of the empire. Russians, Georgians, Armenians, and Azerbaijanis studied here, all preparing to defend their common homeland. It was here that the foundations were laid for the international mindset that would enable him to successfully command a multinational army in the future. The accelerated military training course took only 8 months. The war demanded officers. In June 1915, 2nd Lieutenant Bagramyan was assigned to the 154th Derbent Infantry Regiment, which was part of the Caucasian Army. His first place of service was the Turkish border, where fierce battles with Ottoman troops were taking place. The Caucasian front had its own peculiarities. Here, the Russian army fought in mountainous conditions against Turkish troops supported by German instructors. The young 2nd Lieutenant Bagramyan quickly realized that war in the mountains was radically different from training exercises. It required special courage, ingenuity, and the ability to make independent decisions in a constantly changing situation. Bagramyan gained his first combat experience during an offensive operation in the Erzurum area in the winter of 1915 to 1916. This offensive became one of the most successful operations of the Russian army on the Caucasian front. The young officer proved himself to be a brave and enterprising commander, for which he was awarded the Order of St. Stanislaus, 3rd class, with swords and bow. But what shaped the character of the future commander in the trenches of World War I? Heroism or the tragedies of war? Bagramyan learned from his own experience what it meant to lose comrades and to be responsible for the lives of his subordinates. He saw how ill-informed decisions by the command led to unnecessary sacrifices and understood the need for careful preparation for any military operation. In 1917, the army began to disintegrate. The February Revolution shook the troops, and soldiers began to refuse to fight. Chaos reigned at the front, officers lost their authority, and many units abandoned their positions without permission. In these conditions, the young Armenian officer had to make a difficult choice. What was more important to him? Military discipline or revolutionary ideas? Bagramyan sided with the provisional government and tried to maintain the combat readiness of his unit. He understood that the collapse of the army would mean defeat in the war and disaster for the country. However, events unfolded rapidly, and soon news of the October Revolution arrived. The Caucasian army finally collapsed, and the officers had to decide their own fate. After the collapse of the Caucasian army, the 20-year-old Bagramyan found himself at a crossroads. Many of his fellow officers went abroad or joined the White Movement. Ivan, however, made a decision that determined his entire future. He returned to his native Tiflis and joined the Red Army in 1918. This decision was not easy for him. Raised in the traditions of officer honor and loyalty to the emperor, Bagramyan thought long and hard about his choice. But in the end, he was won over by the understanding that Soviet power offered equality to all peoples of the empire, including the Armenians. Who could have foreseen that this very decision would pave the way to the heights of military glory? The civil war in the Caucasus was particularly brutal and chaotic. The Reds and Whites, Turkish interventionists and local nationalists, British troops and German units all fought here. In this extremely difficult situation, Bagramyan served in various positions, from company commander to assistant chief of staff of a division. In 1919, he participated in battles against General Denikin's troops in the North Caucasus. Here, his extraordinary abilities as a staff officer became apparent. Bagramyan was able to quickly analyze the situation and draw up clear reports and plans of operations. Commanders began to entrust him with the most responsible tasks. The young officer particularly distinguished himself during the defense of Astrakhan in 1919. The city was of strategic importance, as it was the route for supplying Soviet troops in the south. The White Army made several attempts to capture Astrakhan, but each time they met with organized resistance, And what role did the Armenian staff officer, who was still little known at the time, play in this defense? Bagramyan worked in the division headquarters and was responsible for planning defensive measures. His schemes for the engineering preparation of positions and plans to repel enemy attacks showed a deep understanding of the tactics of modern warfare. The command highly appreciated his work, and he was soon promoted. After the end of the Civil War, the Red Army faced the task of reorganizing and preparing for possible future conflicts. Bagramyan was sent to study at the Frunze Military Academy of the Red Army, which trained senior command personnel. This was a recognition of his abilities and potential for further growth. At the academy, Ivan Khristoforovich studied military history, strategy and tactics, and military economics. He was particularly interested in the planning of large-scale offensive operations. He analyzed the experience of World War I, studied military reforms in European countries, and tried to understand what the war of the future would look like. The Academy's teachers noted Bagramyan's analytical mind and his ability to see military problems in a complex way. He not only absorbed theoretical knowledge, but also tried to rethink it creatively. How could they have known that they were preparing one of the future architects of the greatest military victory in history? After graduating from the academy in 1924, Bagramyan was assigned to staff work in the Kiev military district. Here, he was involved in planning exercises, developing operational documents, and training personnel. This work allowed him to thoroughly study all aspects of managing large military units. In Kiev, Bagramyan married Tamara Amirbekova, who was also of Armenian descent. Family life gave him the support and stability he needed for his demanding military service. Tamara understood the importance of her husband's work and always supported him during difficult moments in his career. By the mid-1930s, Captain Bagramyan had become one of the most promising staff officers in the Red Army. His analytical skills and deep understanding of military affairs attracted the attention of the High Command. In 1935, he was transferred to the General Staff, where he was tasked with developing operational plans for the Western Front. Working at the General Staff opened up completely new horizons for Bagramyan. Here, he gained access to secret information about the state of the armed forces of potential adversaries and studied possible scenarios for future wars. He was particularly concerned about the rearmament of the German army and the aggressive policies of Nazi Germany. But could he have imagined then that in a few years he would have to put all these theoretical developments into practice? At the General Staff, Bagramyan worked on plans for the deployment of troops to cover the state border and studied the specifics of conducting combat operations in the event of a sudden enemy attack. The tragic events of 1937 to 1938 did not bypass Bagramyan. The repression against the Red Army Command affected many of his colleagues and friends. Marshals and generals with whom he had worked were arrested, and experienced officers who knew their business disappeared. Bagramyan himself was spared the repressions. But the atmosphere of suspicion and fear seriously affected the work of the military apparatus. Many officers were afraid to show initiative, fearing accusations of sabotage or treason. In such conditions, people who were able to maintain their professionalism and dedication to their work became especially valuable. In 1939, Bagramyan was appointed Chief of Staff of the 12th Army of the Kiev Special Military District. This was a significant step in his career. For the first time, he was given a position that involved independent responsibility for planning the operations of a large military unit. The 12th Army was stationed in one of the most important sections of the western border of the USSR. Who could have known that it was here that some of the most dramatic events of the beginning of the Great Patriotic War would unfold? Bagramyan carefully studied the terrain, developed defense plans, and organized cooperation with neighboring units. During this period, he first became closely acquainted with General Georgy Zhukov, who commanded the Kiev Special Military District. Zhukov immediately recognized the professional qualities of the Armenian staff officer and began to entrust him with the most difficult tasks. This acquaintance determined much of Bagramyan's future military career. Events in Western Europe were developing in a threatening manner. Germany had captured Austria and Czechoslovakia, started a war with Poland, and defeated France. It was becoming clear that sooner or later Hitler would turn his attention to the East. The Soviet leadership understood the inevitability of military confrontation and was intensively preparing for war. Bagramyan participated in the development of plans for the strategic deployment of the Red Army and analyzed the possible directions of the enemy's main attack. His calculations showed that the Germans would attempt several powerful strikes, with the aim of encircling and destroying the main forces of the Soviet troops in the border areas. By the beginning of 1941, Colonel Bagramyan had become one of the most experienced staff officers in the Red Army. He had solid theoretical training, extensive experience in staff work, and a deep understanding of modern military art. But was he ready for the test that would soon befall the Soviet Union? The dawn of June 22, 1941, was a turning point not only for the entire Soviet Union, but also for Colonel Ivan Bagramyan. At 4 a.m. Moscow time, German artillery opened fire on Soviet positions, and a few minutes later, the first German bombers appeared in the sky. The Great Patriotic War had begun. The headquarters of the 12th Army, where Bagramyan served, was located in the city of Lviv. In the first hours of the war, it became clear that the enemy had struck with tremendous force. Communication with border units was interrupted, and contradictory reports came in about enemy breakthroughs in different sections of the front. But who could have imagined the scale of the catastrophe that befell the Red Army? As Chief of Staff of the Army, Bagramyan had to collect and analyze all the information coming in, assess the situation, and prepare proposals for the commander. However, the reality turned out to be much worse than even the most pessimistic forecasts. German tank groups broke through the defenses and rapidly advanced deep into Soviet territory. The 12th Army came under attack from General Kleist's tank group, which was advancing in the direction of Kiev. The army units, stretched along the border, were unable to create a continuous line of defense. The enemy, using its superiority in aviation and the concentration of tanks on narrow sections of the front, easily broke through the Soviet positions. In these critical conditions, Bagramyan's best qualities as a staff officer came to the fore. He remained calm and analytical in his assessment of the situation, even when chaos reigned around him during the retreat. His reports to higher headquarters were accurate and objective, which helped the command make the right decisions. It was during these tragic days of June 1941 that the character of the future commander was forged. Bagramyan saw how unpreparedness for war and mistakes by the command led to huge losses among soldiers and officers. He understood that defeating such a strong enemy would require not only courage and self-sacrifice, but also great military skill. By the end of June, the 12th Army had retreated far to the east. Many of its units were destroyed or surrounded. The army headquarters, suffering heavy losses, fought its way from Lviv through Ternopil to the Dnieper. During this retreat, Bagramyan proved himself not only as a staff officer, but also as an organizer who was able to maintain control of the troops in a critical situation. During the retreat to the Dnieper, an episode occurred that characterizes Bagramyan as a man of high moral qualities. When the headquarters column came under German bombing, the colonel personally helped evacuate the wounded, risking his own life. Such behavior on the part of the commander earned the respect of his subordinates and strengthened their belief in the possibility of resisting the enemy. In July 1941, the remnants of the 12th Army were incorporated into other formations, and Bagramyan was appointed to the headquarters of the Southwestern Front. Here, he was involved in planning defensive operations and attempting to organize counterattacks against the advancing German troops. But would the experience and knowledge he had accumulated during years of peacetime service be enough to counter the military machine of the Third Reich? Working at the front headquarters, Bagramyan studied the enemy's tactics and analyzed the reasons for the Red Army's failures in the first months of the war. He understood that the Germans surpassed the Soviet troops, not only in technology, but also in the level of training of the command staff, the organization of inter-service cooperation, and the command and communications system. The Battle of Moscow was the first serious test for Ivan Bagramyan as an independent commander of a large formation. In August 1941, he was appointed commander of the 3rd Rifle Division, which was part of the Western Front. This appointment was a turning point in his military career. He went from being a staff officer to a commander directly responsible for the combat operations of his subordinates. By the time Bagramyan arrived, the 3rd Rifle Division had been significantly depleted in battle. Of the 10,000 men in the unit, less than 4,000 remained. There was a shortage of artillery, ammunition, and communications equipment. Many units were manned by untrained conscripts who were holding weapons for the first time. But what could be done to turn these demoralized remnants into a combat-ready unit? Bagramyan understood that the most important thing now was to restore discipline and the soldiers' belief in the possibility of victory. He personally visited all the units of the division, talked with the commanders, identified the most pressing problems and ways to solve them. The first thing the new commander did was to establish a system of command and communication. Without clear command, any unit turns into a disorganized mob. Bagramyan demanded that his subordinates carry out orders precisely and report on the situation in a timely manner. Gradually, order began to be established in the division. In September 1941, the Germans launched a general offensive on Moscow, Operation Typhoon. Army Group Center was to encircle and destroy the main forces of the Western, Reserve, and Bryansk fronts, and then capture the Soviet capital. The enemy threw more than 1 million soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft into the offensive. Bagramyan's division took up defensive positions on one of the main enemy attack directions. What could a weakened Soviet division oppose to elite German units? The commander understood that in open combat, his unit would not be able to withstand the superior forces of the enemy. Therefore, he relied on the competent use of the terrain and the engineering preparation of positions. Bagramyan personally selected locations for firing positions, organized a system of anti-tank obstacles, and created resistance nodes in key areas. His military education and staff experience helped him see the battlefield through the eyes of a tactician who understood the strengths and weaknesses of the defense. When the German offensive began, the division met the enemy with organized fire. For several days, it held back the attacks of superior enemy forces, inflicting significant losses on them. Bagramyan was constantly at the front lines, inspiring the soldiers to resist by his personal example. However, the overall situation at the front was unfavorable. The Germans managed to break through the defenses in neighboring areas and create a threat of encirclement. The division had to retreat, fighting heavy defensive battles. But was it able to maintain its combat capability during this retreat? Bagramyan's division's retreat was well organized. The commander planned intermediate defense lines in advance, organized cover for the retreating units, and ensured that heavy weapons and ammunition were preserved. Thanks to this approach, the division avoided defeat and retained a significant part of its personnel. By the end of October 1941, the division had taken up defensive positions on the approaches to Moscow. Here, in the battle for the capital, all of Bagramyan's commanding qualities came to the fore. His unit held its ground, repelling fierce attacks by the enemy, who was determined to break through to Moscow at any cost. After the successful defense of Moscow, Major General Bagramyan's name became known in the highest military circles. His division was one of the few that not only withstood the German onslaught, but also inflicted serious losses on the enemy. In December 1941, he was appointed commander of the 16th Rifle Corps, which was operating on the Western Front. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was a time of great success for the Red Army. The counteroffensive near Moscow showed that the invincible Wehrmacht could not only be stopped, but also forced to retreat. Bagramyan's corps took an active part in this offensive, liberating settlements in the Moscow region from the German invaders. But what did the success near Moscow mean in the context of the entire war? And could it change the overall strategic situation? Bagramyan understood that this was only the first step towards victory. The Germans retained enormous forces on the Eastern Front and were preparing new offensive operations. In the summer of 1942, they planned to launch their main attack in the southern direction. In the spring of 1942, Bagramyan's corps was redeployed to the Stalingrad direction. The Supreme Command headquarters anticipated that this was where the main events of the summer campaign would unfold. The Germans sought to capture the Caucasus, with its oil resources, and cut across the Volga, the most important transport artery of the USSR. Preparations to repel the German offensive were in full swing. Bagramyan studied the specifics of conducting combat operations in steppe terrain, organized anti-tank defenses, and prepared reserves for counterattacks. His experience in the Battle of Moscow helped him to correctly assess the enemy's capabilities and plan his own actions. In June 1942, the German offensive began on the southern section of the front. Operation Blau. Army Group South launched a powerful strike in the direction of Voronezh and Stalingrad. Bagramyan's corps found itself in the direction of the enemy's auxiliary strike and fought heavy defensive battles. Would the experience gained near Moscow help in the new conditions of steppe warfare? Bagramyan quickly realized that defense in the steppe had its own peculiarities. It was impossible to use natural obstacles here, so it was necessary to create an artificial system of strongpoints and resistance nodes. The summer battles of 1942 demonstrated the increased skill of the Soviet troops. Although the Germans managed to advance far to the east, their offensive no longer had the rapid character it had in 1941. The Red Army had learned to conduct organized defense and deliver effective counterattacks. Bagramyan's corps distinguished itself in the battles near Voronezh, where the Germans attempted to force the Don River. For several days, his units held an important crossing, preventing the enemy from developing an offensive in that direction. For these battles, Bagration was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. In August 1942, fighting began directly for Stalingrad. General Paulus's 6th German Army sought to capture the city and reach the Volga. Bagramyan's corps was transferred to Stalingrad and included in the troops defending the approaches to the city. Here, in the Don steppes, all of Bagramyan's best qualities as a commander came to the fore. He skillfully organized the interaction of different branches of the military, used artillery to deliver precise strikes against the enemy, and created reserves to repel tank attacks. But would all these skills be enough to stop the Wehrmacht machine at the walls of Stalingrad? The battles at Stalingrad became a school of military skill for many Soviet commanders. Bagramyan learned the art of maneuverable defense, studied the tactics of the enemy, and gained experience in commanding large units in modern warfare. This experience soon came in handy in a new stage of his military career. The Kursk Bulge became a turning point not only in the entire Great Patriotic War, but also in the military career of Lieutenant General Ivan Bagramyan. In the spring of 1943, he was appointed commander of the 16th Army, which was to play a key role in the upcoming battles. This appointment was a sign of how much his leadership skills were appreciated at the highest level. The 16th Army was defending the northern flank of the Kursk salient, right where the Germans were planning to launch one of the main attacks in Operation Citadel. But did the 46-year-old Armenian general know then that he was about to command the greatest tank battle in human history? Preparations for the Battle of Kursk began immediately after the end of the winter campaign. The Soviet command received accurate information about the enemy's plans and decided to meet the German offensive with a prepared defense. Bagramyan personally supervised the creation of defensive lines in his army's sector. Bagration's army received powerful reinforcement with artillery and anti-tank weapons. It included experienced rifle divisions, tank, and self-propelled artillery regiments, and engineering units. The total strength of the formation exceeded 100,000 men. It was one of the strongest armies of the Red Army. The commander paid special attention to the engineering preparation of the defense. A deeply echeloned system of trenches, communication passages, anti-tank ditches, and minefields was created in the direction of the expected enemy attack. But would these fortifications be able to stop General Model's tank wedges? At 5 o'clock in the morning on July 5, 1943, German artillery opened fire on Soviet positions. Operation Citadel began, the Wehrmacht's last attempt to turn the tide of war on the Eastern Front. General Model's 9th Army delivered a powerful blow to the positions of Bagramyan's 16th Army. The first hours of the battle showed that the Germans had employed new tactics. They concentrated a large number of new Tiger heavy tanks and Ferdinand self-propelled guns on a narrow section of the front, which were supposed to break through the Soviet defenses. They were followed by infantry, whose task was to secure the captured lines. Bagramyan was at the command post, where he closely monitored developments. He understood that the main thing now was to prevent a breakthrough of the defenses on the main direction and to maintain control of the troops. The commander personally coordinated the actions of the artillery, aviation, and, after the triumph at Kursk, new strategic opportunities opened up for the Red Army. The Supreme Command began planning a large-scale offensive operation to liberate Belarus, which was given the codename Bagration, in honor of the hero of the Patriotic War of 1812. And who else but an Armenian general bearing the name of the Great Commander was to become one of the main executors of this grandiose plan. In November 1943, General Bagramyan was appointed commander of the First Baltic Front. This was a recognition of his outstanding leadership abilities. For the first time in the history of the Red Army, an Armenian was given command of an entire front. In his new position, he was to command a 500,000-strong group of troops. The First Baltic Front held positions in the northwestern direction and was to play a key role in the future Operation Bagration. The front was tasked with breaking through the heavily fortified defenses of Army Group North and advancing towards Riga and Tallinn. Bagration immersed himself in preparations for the upcoming operation. He personally studied the terrain along the front line, analyzed the German fortifications, and developed plans for artillery preparation. The commander understood that the success of the operation depended on thorough preparation and secrecy in the concentration of troops. Bagration paid particular attention to the preparation of the command staff. He conducted war games, in which various options for the development of the offensive were worked out. Army, corps, and division commanders had to know not only their tasks, but also understand the overall plan of the operation. In the spring of 1944, the covert concentration of troops for Operation Bagration began. New divisions, tank corps, and artillery regiments arrived in the First Baltic Front Zone. The total strength of the group reached 600,000 men, 5,000 guns and mortars, and 800 tanks and self-propelled guns. But could even such a powerful force break through the defenses of an enemy that had been preparing its positions for 2 years? The Germans had created a deeply echeloned system of fortifications in Belarus, which they considered impregnable. Army Group Center had more than 500,000 soldiers and officers in its ranks. Bagramyan developed an original tactic for breaking through enemy defenses. Instead of a traditional frontal assault, he planned to deliver several powerful strikes in different directions, which would fragment the enemy's forces and deprive them of the ability to maneuver their reserves. In May 1944, a meeting was held at the General Headquarters, at which the plan for Operation Bagration was finally approved. Stalin personally spoke with the commanders of the fronts participating in the operation. Bagramyan reported on the readiness of his front and received approval for his proposals on the tactics of the offensive. The operation was scheduled to begin on June 23rd, exactly 3 years after the start of the Great Patriotic War. It was symbolic that the liberation of Belarus began on the anniversary of the tragic events of 1941. Would the Red Army be able to liberate in a few weeks the territory that the Germans had taken months to capture. A few days before the start of the operation, Bagramyan visited all the armies on his front. He talked with commanders, inspected the readiness of the troops, and checked the work of the rear services. The commander saw that his soldiers and officers were determined to achieve victory and ready for heavy fighting. On June 22nd, a directive on the upcoming offensive was read out to the troops. Soldiers and officers learned that they were about to participate in one of the largest operations of the war. The morale of the troops was very high. Everyone understood the importance of the upcoming battles for the final defeat of Nazi Germany. The dawn of June 23, 1944, was marked by a powerful artillery barrage that shook the forests and swamps of Belarus. More than 9,000 guns and mortars of the 4 Soviet fronts simultaneously opened fire on the positions of Army Group Center. Operation Bagration began, one of the most outstanding offensive operations of World War II. The First Baltic Front, commanded by Bagramyan, struck in the Vitebsk direction. His troops were tasked with breaking through enemy defenses north of Vitebsk and advancing on Polotsk. But did the front commander know that in 20 days his troops would liberate an area larger than France? The artillery preparation lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. During this time, Soviet artillery fired more than 1 million shells and mines at the enemy. German fortifications were reduced to ruins. The defense system was disrupted, and many communication nodes were destroyed. The enemy suffered heavy losses even before the infantry attack began. At 8:30 a.m., the rifle divisions of the First Baltic Front went on the offensive. Supported by tanks and aircraft, they rapidly overcame the first line of German defense. The enemy, stunned by the force of the attack, was unable to organize effective resistance at the front lines. Bagramyan closely monitored the progress of the offensive from his command post. Every half hour, he received reports from army commanders on the advance of their troops. The picture was favorable. In all directions, the front's units were breaking through the German defenses and advancing. By the end of the first day of the offensive, the front's troops had advanced 15 to 20 kilometers. This was an outstanding result, especially considering the complexity of the terrain and the strength of the German fortifications. What made it possible to achieve such success on the very first day of the operation? The main factor in the success was the thorough preparation of the operation. Bagramyan and his staff spent months studying the enemy, developing detailed plans for artillery support, and preparing the coordination of the various branches of the armed forces. Each commander knew his task and understood how its execution would affect the success of the entire operation. The second day of the operation brought new successes. The front's troops liberated Vitebsk, a key German defense hub in the northern sector. The enemy attempted to organize counterattacks, but Soviet tank units quickly repelled them and continued their advance. The pace of advance reached 30 kilometers per day. The German command was shocked by the scale of the disaster. Army Group Center was losing control of its troops, with many units surrounded or retreating in panic. Hitler forbade the withdrawal of troops from their positions, which only accelerated the defeat of the German divisions. By the end of the first week of the operation, it was clear that the German defense in Belarus had collapsed. Bagramyan's troops liberated dozens of settlements and advanced towards the borders of the Baltic states. But would the front be able to maintain such a high rate of advance with the lengthening of communications? Bagramyan was well aware of the problems of a rapid advance. The troops were cut off from their supply bases, and there were difficulties with the delivery of ammunition and fuel. But the commander decided to continue the offensive, not giving the enemy the opportunity to gain a foothold at intermediate lines. By mid-July, the troops of the First Baltic Front had reached the borders of Latvia. In 3 weeks of offensive operations, they advanced 300 kilometers, liberated a significant part of Belarus, and inflicted a heavy defeat on the enemy. Operation Bagration exceeded all expectations of the Soviet command. The success of the operation made Bagramyan's name known throughout the world. The foreign press wrote about the outstanding Armenian commander, who commanded one of the most successful fronts of the Red Army. And who could have guessed that this was only the beginning of a triumphant march to the Baltic Sea. The advance of the First Baltic Front to the borders of Latvia opened a new stage in the war: the liberation of the Baltic states. These lands were of particular importance to the USSR. They contained important ports on the Baltic Sea, through which it was possible to establish contact with the Allies. In addition, the liberation of the Baltic states meant the final expulsion of the invaders from the territory of the Soviet Union. Bagramyan understood the complexity of the upcoming battles. The Germans considered the Baltic states to be their last stronghold in the east, and were prepared to fight for every city. Army Group North, under the command of General Schörner, received orders to hold the region at all costs and prevent Soviet troops from reaching the Baltic Sea. But what could even an experienced German force oppose to a front that had just won a brilliant victory in Belarus? Bagramyan's troops were determined to see the job through to the end and reach the sea. The morale of the units was at its highest. In August 1944, the offensive on Riga began. The Latvian capital was heavily fortified by the Germans and was a veritable fortress. The enemy had created several defensive belts around the city, each of which had to be taken by storm. Bagramyan developed a plan to gradually tighten the encirclement around Riga. His armies advanced from the north, east, and south, narrowing the territory controlled by the enemy. At the same time, preparations were made for the assault on the city itself. The fortification system was studied, and assault aviation was prepared. A distinctive feature of the fighting in the Baltic states was the active participation of the local population in the liberation. Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian partisans provided Soviet troops with valuable intelligence, carried out sabotage in the German rear, and pointed out passages through minefields. In September, the front's troops began the assault on the Riga fortifications. The fighting was exceptionally fierce on both sides. The Germans understood that the loss of Riga would mean the collapse of their entire defense in the Baltic states, and they fought with the desperation of the doomed. But would the city's defenders have enough strength to resist the superior forces of the Soviet troops for long? The assault on Riga lasted several days. Soviet troops slowly but steadily advanced through the streets of the city, clearing it of the enemy block by block. Artillery and aviation suppressed German strongholds, while infantry and tanks completed their destruction. On October 13, 1944, Riga was completely liberated. It was one of the most significant victories of the First Baltic Front. The liberation of the Latvian capital paved the way for the complete cleansing of the Baltic states of German troops. After the capture of Riga, Bagramyan's front faced a new task: to reach the Baltic Sea and cut off Army Group North from the rest of the German forces. This operation was named Memel, after the port city that was to be liberated. The advance towards the sea began in October 1944. Overcoming stubborn enemy resistance, the front's troops advanced through forests and swamps towards the coast. How did the soldiers and officers feel as they marched westwards towards victory for the first time in years, rather than retreating eastwards? On October 10th, the advanced units of the First Baltic Front reached the Baltic Sea in the Palanga area. It was a historic moment. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Soviet troops had reached the western coast. Army Group North found itself cut off in Courland. The advance to the sea was a triumph of Bagramyan's military leadership. In 4 months of fighting, his front liberated the entire Baltic region, inflicted a heavy defeat on Army Group North, and created the conditions for the final defeat of the enemy in this region. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was a time of preparation for the final decisive operations of the war. The First Baltic Front, having successfully completed the task of liberating the Baltic states, was given a new assignment: to participate in the assault on Nazi Germany's last bastion in the east. The East Prussian operation was supposed to complete the defeat of Army Group North and open the way to Berlin. East Prussia was a powerful fortified area that the Germans had been preparing to defend for several years. It contained numerous long-term fireworks, anti-tank ditches, and minefields. Would even such an experienced commander as Bagramyan be able to overcome this stronghold of German militarism? In December 1944, Bagramyan's front was renamed the Zemland Front and was tasked with advancing in the direction of Königsberg. This assignment underscored the High Command's special confidence in the Armenian general's military talent. He was to storm the capital of East Prussia, a symbol of Prussian militarism. Preparations for the operation were carried out with particular care. Bagramyan personally studied aerial photographs of German fortifications, analyzed the experience of storming other fortresses, and developed plans for artillery preparation. He understood that the assault on Königsberg would require the application of all his accumulated knowledge of military art. Artillery was to play a special role in the upcoming battles. Bagramyan concentrated more than 3,000 guns and mortars of all calibers in the front line. Many of them were specially designed to destroy long-term fortifications. These were powerful howitzers and siege artillery mortars. On January 13, 1945, the East Prussian offensive began. Troops from 3 Soviet fronts simultaneously launched an offensive against German forces in East Prussia. Bagramyan's Zemland Front advanced from the east toward Königsberg. The first days of the operation showed that the Germans were ready to fight to the last. Every city and every village was turned into a fortress. The enemy used all means of resistance, from modern anti-tank weapons to Faustpatronen in the hands of the Volkssturm. But what could desperate defense oppose to the methodical advance of battle-hardened Soviet troops? Bagramyan used the tactic of gradually tightening the encirclement, preventing the enemy from maneuvering reserves and organizing counterattacks. By the end of January, the front's troops had reached the outskirts of Königsberg. The city was surrounded on all sides, but the German garrison refused to surrender. The commandant of the fortress, General Lasch, declared that he would defend the city to the last soldier. The assault on Königsberg began on April 6, 1945. One of the fiercest urban battles of the war lasted 4 days. Soviet troops stormed every building and every block. The Germans fought with fanatical tenacity, turning the city into a pile of rubble. On April 9th, the enemy's resistance was finally broken. General Lasch signed the Act of Surrender of the Königsberg garrison. The last stronghold of East Prussia had fallen. And what did this victory symbolize for the commander who had gone from defending Moscow to storming the enemy's capital? The capture of Königsberg was the crowning achievement of Bagramyan's military career. For this operation, he was awarded the title of Marshal of the Soviet Union, the highest military rank in the country. For the first time in history, an Armenian became a marshal, which emphasized the international nature of the victory. After the fall of Königsberg, the troops of the Zemland Front were tasked with clearing the Zemland Peninsula of the enemy. This operation continued until May 1945 and ended with the complete destruction of the last German forces in East Prussia. The days of May 1945 became a time of great celebration for the entire Soviet people and personally for Marshal Bagramyan. On May 8th, the Act of Unconditional Surrender of Nazi Germany was signed in Karlshorst. The war in Europe ended with the complete victory of the anti-Hitler coalition, and the Armenian Marshal made a significant contribution to this historic victory. By the time of Germany's surrender, the Zemland Front under Bagramyan's command had completely cleared East Prussia of the enemy. The last German garrisons laid down their arms, and the centuries-old history of this militaristic region came to an end. Who could have imagined that it would be an Armenian commander who would have the honor of putting an end to the Prussian military tradition? May 9th, 1945, became Victory Day. In all parts of Bagramyan's front, solemn meetings were held to mark the end of the war. Soldiers and officers who had traveled a long way from the borders of the USSR to defeated Berlin celebrated the long-awaited victory. The Marshal himself was at his headquarters in Königsberg on that day. He accepted congratulations from his subordinates, responded to telegrams from fellow commanders, and reflected on the path he had traveled. In 4 years of war, the modest colonel became a marshal, and his name went down in the history of military art. But what did the Armenian Marshal feel at the moment of triumph? Pride in victory, or grief for his fallen comrades? Bagramyan never forgot the price of victory. Millions of Soviet soldiers and officers gave their lives to liberate their homeland and Europe from fascism. Their feat remained forever in the commander's memory. In June 1945, preparations began for the Victory Parade in Moscow. As commander of the front, Bagramyan was to take part in this grand celebration. On June 24th, he arrived in the capital to participate in the parade. The Victory Parade on June 24th, 1945, became the apotheosis of military glory. Columns of victors marched across Red Square, representing all the fronts and armies that had defeated fascism. Bagramyan marched in the ranks of the front commanders, embodying the international character of the Great Victory. A particularly symbolic moment was when the banners of the defeated German divisions were thrown at the foot of the mausoleum. Among them were the standards of units defeated by Bagramyan's troops in Belarus, the Baltic states, and East Prussia. Could the Armenian boy from Chardakla have dreamed then that he would participate in such a triumph? After the parade, the awarding of war participants began. Bagramyan received the Order of Victory, the highest military award of the USSR, which was awarded only to outstanding commanders. It was a recognition of his exceptional merits in achieving victory over fascism. In the summer of 1945, the demobilization of the Red Army began. Millions of soldiers and officers returned to civilian life. Bagramyan was appointed commander of the Baltic Military District. He was to lead the troops in the liberated Baltic republics. His new position required not only military, but also administrative skills. It was necessary to rebuild the economy destroyed by the war, establish peaceful life, and integrate the Baltic republics into the USSR. Bagramyan coped with these tasks, demonstrating not only his talent as a commander, but also his abilities as a statesman. In August 1945, the Soviet-Japanese War began. Many commanders were transferred to the Far East to participate in the defeat of the Kwantung Army. Bagramyan remained in the Baltic states, but closely followed the course of hostilities against Nazi Germany's last ally. Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, marked the end of World War II. For Bagramyan, it was the end not only of the war, but of an entire era in his life. Ahead of him lay peacetime service and the new challenges of the post-war period. The post-war years opened a new chapter in Marshal Bagramyan's life. Commanding the Baltic Military District required solving many complex problems of the recovery period. It was necessary not only to maintain the combat readiness of the troops, but also to participate in the restoration of the war-torn economies of the three republics. The political situation in the Baltic states remained complex. Local nationalist groups, supported by Western special services, continued their guerrilla war against Soviet power. Would a commander accustomed to open combat be able to cope with an invisible enemy operating underground? Bagramyan approached this problem with his characteristic analytical mind. He understood that repressive measures alone would not solve the problem. It was necessary to win the trust of the local population, demonstrate the advantages of the Soviet system, and isolate the bandits from popular support. Under the Marshal's leadership, a large-scale reconstruction program was launched in the Baltic states. New plants and factories were built, destroyed cities were rebuilt, and jobs were created for the local population. Military construction units actively participated in this work. Bagramyan paid special attention to the training of national military personnel, young Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians who were to become officers in the Soviet Army were trained in the military schools of the district. This was important work for the integration of the Baltic peoples into the single family of Soviet peoples. In 1954, Marshal Bagramyan was appointed head of the Military Academy of the General Staff, the highest military educational institution of the USSR Armed Forces. This appointment was a recognition of his outstanding achievements, not only as a commander, but also as a military theorist. At the academy, Bagramyan was involved in training the top command of the Soviet Army. His lectures on operational art and strategy were attended by future generals and marshals. And what could a commander who had risen from staff captain to marshal of the USSR convey to his students? Bagramyan became the author of fundamental works on military art. His books, This Is How We Went to Victory, and My Memories, became classics of military historical literature. In them, he summarized his rich experience as a military leader and shared his thoughts on the nature of modern warfare. At the Academy, the Marshal continued to study the experience of the Great Patriotic War, analyze the reasons for victories and defeats, and identify patterns in military art. His work contributed to the development of Soviet military science and the training of qualified military personnel. In the 1960s, Bagramyan was involved in public activities. He was a deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR and a member of various committees and commissions. The Marshal actively participated in the patriotic education of young people and met with war veterans. But did the elderly Marshal still have the soul of that young Armenian officer who once dreamed of military glory? Bagramyan never lost touch with his Armenian roots. He maintained contacts with Armenia, helped develop the Republic, and contributed to the perpetuation of the memory of Armenian war heroes. In the 1970s, the Marshal's health began to deteriorate. Years of heavy military service had taken their toll on his body. But even in his old age, he continued to work, wrote his memoirs, met with historians, and participated in perpetuating the memory of the war. On September 21, 1982, Marshal Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan passed away in Moscow. He was 85 years old. He was buried in the Novodevichy Cemetery, among other prominent figures of Soviet history. The name of Marshal Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan is forever inscribed in the history of the Great Patriotic War in golden letters. His life story is a vivid example of how talent and devotion to one's homeland allow a person to reach the heights of military glory, regardless of national origin. And what is the main lesson of this amazing biography for current and future generations? Bagration's military legacy is multifaceted. As a commander, he rose from division commander to front commander and participated in all the major operations of the war. His contribution to the victory at Kursk, Operation Bagration, the liberation of the Baltic states, and the capture of Königsberg cannot be overestimated. Bagramyan's experience in organizing offensive operations seems particularly important. Operation Bagration became a model of military art studied in all military academies around the world. What enabled the Armenian general to achieve such outstanding success in planning and conducting major operations? The main secret of Bagramyan's success was a combination of deep theoretical knowledge and practical experience. He never stopped learning, analyzing the experience of war, and studying the tactics of the enemy. This continuous work on himself allowed him to constantly improve his military skills. Equally important was Bagramyan's ability to work with people. He enjoyed enormous authority among his subordinates, who saw him not only as a talented military leader, but also as a fair and demanding commander. Soldiers and officers trusted their marshal and followed him into the most difficult battles. Bagramyan became a symbol of the international unity of the Soviet people in the fight against fascism. An Armenian by nationality, he commanded Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and representatives of all the peoples of the USSR. His biography refutes any attempts to portray the war as a clash of nations rather than ideologies. The Marshal's post-war activities also deserve high praise. His work at the Military Academy of the General Staff contributed to the training of a new generation of military personnel. His memoirs have become a valuable source for studying the history of the war. What lessons can the modern world learn from the life and work of Marshal Bagramyan? First and foremost, it is a lesson in patriotism and devotion to the motherland. Despite all the difficulties and trials, he never betrayed his duty as a defender of the fatherland. The lesson of professionalism is also important. Bagramyan showed that military affairs require constant study, analysis, and improvement. Modern officers can learn from him the desire for professional growth and the willingness to take responsibility for their subordinates. Bagramyan's biography demonstrates the opportunities that serving the motherland opens up for a person. The son of a simple railway worker was able to become a marshal of the Soviet Union thanks to his talent, hard work, and dedication to his cause. The memory of Marshal Bagramyan is immortalized in numerous monuments, street and square names, and military educational institutions. A monument to this great son of the Armenian people has been erected in Yerevan. Military schools and ships bear his name. But the most important monument to Bagramyan remains the great victory itself, in the achievement of which he played an outstanding role. As long as the memory of the war lives on, so will the memory of the Armenian Marshal who helped save the world from the brown plague of fascism. The life story of Ivan Khristoforovich Bagramyan is a story of how an ordinary person can become great if he serves a great cause. His biography inspires feats in the name of the motherland and reminds us of the price the Soviet people paid for freedom and independence.